Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today I'm joined by Gwen Pope, CEO and co-founder at Tiger Team M&A. Gwen has spent over 15 years leading buy-side and sell-side deals and building M&A functions, including some of the world's most active serial acquirers, including Google, Microsoft, and eBay. Before M&A, she spent a decade in enterprise solution architecture, and it shows in how Tiger Team thinks about value creation as a strategic operating system for dynamic decision-making. Gwen and I have been doing thought work together for a while. We co-authored research on a phenomenon we call the M&A Capability Cliff and how it's driving value loss. Gwen closed day one of the People Synergy Summit, and we're now collaborating on a new event series, an M&A Value Creation Hackathon. One reason we work well together is a shared conviction. Most deal failures aren't about overpaying. They're about what happens after the deal is done, when thesis drifts, sponsors move on, and nobody owns the outcome. Gwen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Clint. Pleasure to join officially. As you mentioned, we knock around plenty of ideas on a back channel and then suss out some of them thinking, well, this would be good to share, or maybe the broader community can help us knock around a solution or poke at a problem. And I think both of us we're perpetual, passionate problem solvers, so we can't resist an elusive set of problems that's like, why is that still a thing? So happy to join. Look forward to digging into some of these topics.
It's fantastic. And I think it's why we've stayed in M&A for as long as we have, right? It's an opportunity-rich environment to do things better with the high failure rate. And you and I have been with some companies that have overcome that.
Yes. Or are maybe midway in their journey.
Yeah. Yeah. So Gwen, let's talk a little about your background. So you spent a decade in solution architecture before getting pulled into M&A. How did that happen and what made you stay in this space?
Yeah. And I think maybe just to keep today's conversation focused, I will skip over the prologue to what you just mentioned, because actually I started in going down a pathway of art and design in my long ago beginnings of my academic career, and then ended up veering into technical scope as far as software engineering and technical architecture, became fascinated with enterprise application integration and service-oriented architecture, et cetera. And I would say mid-2000s, I had my first hands-on brush with M&A. And that was when I was at Oracle and I had built and led their first solution architecture practice, specifically around SOA and service-oriented solutions. And there they did the BEA middleware or BA systems, middleware acquisition. And I was pulled in to provide some input on the product integration roadmap. And I thought, this is fantastically messy and I love it. And I think the short thing there is that I really took the same cross-functional perspective that I was applying to solution architecture to deals and thinking, this is just another type of cross-functional, holistic solution that you need to suss out with interdependencies and patterns of capability versus risk, et cetera. And so not to oversimplify, but to me, it was really sort of the same thing, but with much higher stakes and also much more human, right? Because sometimes when you're delving into technical design and solution architecture, you spend a lot of time in the theoretical and working with systems and code, whereas looking at a deal and trying to orchestrate, whether it's driving diligence, integration planning, orchestrating day one plus execution, then you have to do that with people. That's kind of an unavoidable element. And so that broader holistic view really I found exciting and more fulfilling. And then a couple of years down the road from that, I found myself managing a services-led solution architecture practice within Microsoft, and then quickly got invited to join the venture integration team. And that specific role was still a technical focus, but applied to M&A. So that was the beginning of the end in a good way. And I've been in
Yeah.
M&A ever since.
That's great. Well, and we both have that in common, spending some time with Oracle, which is just an integration machine. The company, at least when you and I were there, was doing 12 to 18 deals a year and had
Yeah,
massive teams dedicated to this kind of work.
and actually that's a good call out, because I think that, and one of the things that I am really thankful for and has been a big part of building my perspective over the years and my capabilities, is the fact that I've had a chance to see behind the curtain for so many, larger serial acquirers, and observe what seems to work and what doesn't, but also the patterns of, value enablers and risk to value, value erosion, et cetera. And of course, not you can't say that the same pattern works at every serial acquirer,
Right.
but there's common denominators. So that was the first place, because they did have such a operational machine. I think that was a really good starting point for me to have an eye opener to, okay, you can approach this like an operating system. So,
Well, so let's talk about those large serial acquirers for a minute. So a lot of companies say, especially if they're expecting to be highly acquisitive, that they want that approach. They want to recognize those patterns and do it well. So, we talk a lot about what works, but what are some of the things that they're almost always missing that keep them from having that repeatable practice, that pattern recognition?
yeah, I love this question because, and this will probably sound familiar to you too, just in your own experience, but I think that the longer that you're in M&A, the more that you have just this instinctive eye roll in reaction to people mentioning playbooks, right? And that's not to say that I don't think you need a playbook, but that what is meant by playbook is pretty different. So now I'll answer your question. And I think that you do need some measure of repeatable templates, right? That you can take off a shelf, so to speak, and apply to parts of deal phases, et cetera. And, and that is necessary. But that alone is A, too static, and B, it's not going to help you with the decision process across the deal life cycle, at least not, not really impactfully. It's also going to be very cookie cutter in terms of risking wasting time on, for instance, diligence scope that isn't applicable to that deal, or maybe overlooking diligence scope or interpretation, right, that is really critical for that deal. And as a silly example, there's a bunch of diligence scope that doesn't matter for what is really just a key talent acquisition, right? And an
Mhm.
acqui-hire.
Right.
You don't need to go, ask for like facility, safety certifications, or whether there was, environmental regulation and approval that was relevant to the target company. I mean, again, silly example, but you can end up wasting the target's time during diligence, wasting your team's time and interpreting things, et cetera. And the same goes for integration planning, et cetera. So back to the question of, well, what do I think repeatability entails, and what does that mean? It means that you have, at least to a certain degree, done an assessment internally, and I'll often nickname it internal diligence, but separate from, ideally, a specific deal going forward. Because you really can only effectively do this if it's in the background, decoupled from the mad rush, right, to get ready for a deal project. But to have some idea of who internally is going to cover the base, whether it's dedicated to M&A or it's a part-time resource, meaning that they have a day job from something else, leading some business function, et cetera. Who's going to cover the basic pieces of whether it's a work stream or integration management, office governance or corp dev, obviously, but understanding the roles and then understanding how does that fit together for decisions. And that's really the key piece that I see missing most of the time, is what are those patterns of decisions that are recurring for most of the deal types that serial acquirer does. So if they find themselves most of the time doing key talent acquisitions and tech and talent deals that have some commercial scope, but for the most part, you're just absorbing the product and people, and you're retiring their operations, et cetera. You're migrating over to your systems, and you're essentially doing a full absorption eventually, and then launching, or relaunching the acquired products. Then that enables you to, to define what those repeatable strategic patterns are. We assume X, Y usually happens. Z is often a big risk. And oh, by the way, you need to be aware of the couple of really big sort of gorilla in the room capability gaps that you have. Know yourself as a serial acquirer and say, we really aren't good at billing integration. Like, never mind the reason for the moment, but just to know what you aren't good at, and then know what the typical implication is for integration planning or diligence. For instance, maybe you want to assume that billing integration is never going to be shorter than 18 months or whatever it is the case may be. So back to the point, it's know yourself, have a at least rough idea of the strategic, common threads across deals. And then ultimately, and the good news is you can build up to this iteratively over time, but ultimately start to tie those strategic patterns over to your templates so that then okay, well, yeah, we can use that template for integration planning. But if it's this type of deal, then we're going to remove that scope, or we're going to add that scope, or we're going to have these work streams or not, et cetera. And that there's certain dependencies across, certain parts of the plan. So it's a long way of saying you need to be dynamic. You also need to know yourself. So you can apply things in more agile fashion and smarter. Know why you're doing the deal and be able to, apply your resources accordingly.
Yeah. Well, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think about it almost like the playbook's almost like the driver's manual, right? It tells you what to do in ideal road conditions when everybody's behaving, but then all of a sudden when it's raining out or somebody's being crazy on the road. And I'm thinking about this because I drove home in a rainstorm last night, and there was a guy who had maybe had one too many, you know, uh, and I had to react in a different way than the manual says. And so I think there's something to be said for having that experience, knowing your capabilities, the vehicle you're in, that I think we often overlook when the default answer is, well, just have a playbook. Like, it's a baseline,
Yes,
and it's not always the way things go.
that's right.
So you talked for a moment about understanding the strategic reasons behind deals. So and the playbooks, I think this is a great example. So when we look at the deal thesis, and you talk a lot about having a deal North Star. So when that deadline pressure hits, when the team wants to go cookie cutter from the playbook, and all of a sudden that deal thesis is out of the spotlight, where have you seen that cause problems in a deal?
Everywhere. I'm not trying to be flip, but I'll say something that I've long subscribed to. But honestly, it's also become one of the cornerstone to the framework that now the company that I helped found uses. It underlies the way that we provide services, but also the way that we architected our platform. And that is, you're going to have upstream anchor points for reasoning for why do the deal, and how do you think it's going to be optimal to execute so that you can then realize whatever the value is, that you're intending to capture. And at the most compact, early stage form of that thing, then you're talking about essentially capturing what the senior leadership, the often termed the deal steerco, is sitting down and aligning on, as far as, like, if nothing else, these are the things that we need to align on and decide before taking a run at the deal, and then having an internal go, no go, and then going and negotiating an LOI with the target, right? And those things usually boil down to aspects like, well, what's the strategic intent, right? Back to the patterns and saying, is it acquiring key talent? Is it accelerating our product roadmap? Is it expanding into a new geography, et cetera? And understanding what those patterns then entail, as far as, well, then that means we are assuming just directionally that requires this type of execution,
Mhm.
right? So to get that kind of strategic intent in play and capture XYZ value, even if you're not quantifying the value, right? Just to say this is the type of value we're after, then that will then correlate to a certain type of execution. And again, I'm not talking about an integration plan at that point, but just a body of sort of guiding assumptions. And so when you don't have that, then that quickly devolves even as early as diligence, because in typical diligence, as you know well, you're on a clock, right? You're burning down the fuse of the exclusivity timeframe, which no corp dev leader is going to want to have to go back to the target and their bankers and negotiate an extension. Like, if at all possible, let's not open that back up, right? So we're looking at a time box on runway for requesting information and gathering that information. And then, oh, by the way, usually at a delay too, right?
Of
Last
course.
minute dumps of data from the target company, sometimes for very legitimate reasons. But then your team internally needs time to go through and actually review that information and in short order understand, well, is this good or is this an issue? Is this open item that the target company is either late or maybe refusing to provide information on? Is it really inconsequential or is it actually an issue? And then as you get really close to like essentially the cutoff of, hey, we're not doing diligence anymore, we're shifting to go, no go and figuring out closing conditions, then you're usually asked as, a functional work stream leader, hey, do you have any 11th hour super urgent requests for supplemental asks? Like maybe it's a double or triple click on a certain topic, like, hey, those reports on product support pipelines where there's like mounting escalating tickets for tier 3 engineering requests? Let's dig into that a little bit. Or how about the customer churn rate that's been skyrocketing over the past 6 months, right? So to do all that though, and in short order, you need to know why you're doing the deal and what's the most important set of value drivers. Maybe the existing customers. It's not great to hear that there's customer churn, and it might actually say something about the quality of their product. But in a sense, you care less about the customers than you do the key talent and the underlying product capabilities, depending on the type of deal. So it's to say that you are going to waste your time, you're going to misdirect your analysis, and you're probably going to come up with a faulty integration plan, let alone set the wrong targets for synergy assumptions. And then if you're in a larger serial acquirer and making commitments up to the board level on here's what we're going to deliver, right, as a result of this deal at 6 months, at 9 months, a year, et cetera. And it's going to have a 20% uplift, cross-selling, cross-product revenue, et cetera. Then you should probably have embedded that upstream anchor point in your integration planning. So across the board, it's one of the most important things that you can do is to keep that thing embedded.
So, Gwen, out of that, I've got a couple of questions, but let me start with revenue synergies. So, we've talked quite a bit in the past about synergies that aren't tracked, aren't managed. So, we love the war stories. So, where have you seen revenue synergy assumptions go wrong? Would love to hear one of your war stories here.
Yeah. Um, so the tricky bit with revenue synergies, just to preface this a little bit, sometimes they aren't well enough understood. So no one wants to quantify them and really commit to something other than, well, we might get somewhere between 5 and 10% uplift, cross product, et cetera. It's and the part of the difficulty is understanding how to break down the assumptions underneath. Like, what are you assuming gets you to that uplift at X number of months post close? Are you assuming that as the buyer, our existing customers are going to, like, 10% of them or 50% of them within the first year are going to buy that acquired product? And are you assuming that they're going to do it at the legacy prices or at the prices that we transition to? And oh, by the way, are they going to, as enterprise customers, are they going to accept the fact that they still have to contract and do separate, invoicing before we merge and do billing integration and contracting integration, et cetera? Meaning, is there friction, right, for the segment of customers that you're assuming? So just to say that it's difficult to understand and build those assumptions in a robust way, but it's also, to cut serial acquirers some slack, it's also typically inordinately hard, especially before you do billing and contracting integration, inordinately hard to actually track what that is you want to measure. So attributing revenue, let alone even just customer acquisition, to an acquired product means that you have to rely usually on data points that are in the target company's legacy systems, right? And they're using different identifiers. You don't have the product in your system as a SKU. So then not only is there a big lag in sorting out through that data, but also you're having to normalize across various systems and various, data schemas, and having to make sense of, well, okay, fuzzy math, we think that we're maybe hitting whatever. So that is to say, we can cut serial acquirers some slack. Then again, back to my earlier point, you have to know yourself. You have to know that maybe it's really hard or next to impossible to do that, and then come up with an approach that you agree on to then sort of directionally target that. But to your question about a story around this, I'll say, we often talk about, as practitioners, the aspect of a deal or project getting tossed over the wall, right? And, and we'll groan about it, we'll laugh about it, et cetera. But honestly, it's more common than not to a certain degree. And part of that, of course, is because you have to keep an information tent relatively small early on. But one of the deals that I was involved in some years back, and I won't name names so we can protect the innocent or semi-innocent, but
Right.
it was a multi-billion-dollar deal for an acquisition that was absolutely, it included commercial scope. It had globally distributed facilities and teams, et cetera. It had a portfolio of products, so quite complex. And the decision to do the deal was made at the C level, and it was essentially a back-of-the-napkin agreement.
Uh,
Now, that isn't to say that the folks in the room weren't all smart and had a sense that, this is a good thing to do and there's a rationale here that will fly. But the assumptions weren't shaped or pressure tested through the lens of how are you going to execute?
right.
And that's the tricky bit, right? Which I think, most folks and most of your audience are going to go, yep, that's a stumbling block for sure. You can have the most perfect strategy or deal thesis in the world. And if you don't understand or try to define how are you going to execute to make that happen, then your thesis is just not worth anything, right? It's academic. So my point being that to have this deal, and, I was in a very senior integration leader role myself at the time, and typically I'd be pulled in well, pre-close. And we're talking about typically pre-LOI. So to hear that, no, actually, this thing is closing like now, like tonight,
Oh my gosh.
was a bit out of the norm. And so we had to do, it was what it was. We had to then scramble for day one town halls, right? To try to welcome and enable and onboard the acquired teams across the globe. But I will say that the trickiest bit there, the biggest impact, was that from a cultural perspective, not only was there a lot of distinct differences in culture, but there was not, shouldn't even say good, there was not any understanding yet until well post-close of how the people and functions within the target company supported the life cycle of a customer
Mm.
for their products. And years back, I was the go-to-market M&A lead at Google at the time, involved in the Looker acquisition. And I mentioned that because I have nothing but good things to say about that acquisition. And the folks, the Looker folks coming into the company were just lovely to work with and super, super smart. And one of the things that they actually introduced within our pre-close process for integration planning has always stuck with me. And I think it's such a fabulous idea. Whether you're doing it pre-close, which is ideal, or post-close as sort of a scramble like I'm describing now, it's immensely helpful. And they nicknamed it the life of the dollar. And it
Okay.
was this presentation and then and then followed by a joint sort of walk the wall session that we did, where we came out of it understanding at a high level, like, here's the functions and systems that touch and support each phase of the life of a customer, right? All the way from lead through contracting, billing, et cetera, and post contract support and then renewals and all that. And so my point there is that with the acquisition story that I was pointing to that's not named, post-close, we really found out that we had a bunch of behavioral, and I don't mean like individual behavior, but behavioral driver mismatches. Like, we weren't going to be able to drive revenue growth cross product because there was such a distinct divide and misalignment between how they did sales, how we did sales, right? Comp plans, territories, incentives, and promos around, product for sales play purposes. So that on top of the usual like systems integration, long pole in the tent that I described earlier, which makes tracking revenue synergies super hard. It was a hot mess, to use the
Yeah.
technical term. Yep. So that's probably one of the best examples I could point to. But it also, like I said, it pulls in some real opportunities for learnings and shines a spotlight on, like, why was that a hot mess, right? So again, know yourself.
Right. Well, so Gwen, I want to pivot the conversation now. We can't get away from an AI conversation in the world of M&A. And
Hmm.
part of what I enjoy about our conversations is that most of the AI use cases these days are all at the front end of the deal, right? They're accelerating diligence. And when you and I wrote that piece on the capability cliff, it was all about how the front end is getting faster and the execution side is actually shrinking, right? They're taking people out of the integration process and in an effort to save money. And we got AI making it faster on the front end, tossing to fewer people, creating a lot of challenges. So let's talk a little bit about AI on the execution side. And so
Hmm.
I know this is an area where you're really passionate. Where does AI, that generic AI, fall short on M&A decisions? And let's talk a little bit about that for folks that are
Yeah.
relying on Chat GPT to help with their integration.
Yeah. Which, by the way, I'm not going to knock completely. I think that all the tools or types of tools that we're about to touch on, they have their place. And I've started to see some really good commentary and smart thinking out and about that's getting published around how it's not an either or, it's an and, right?
Mm.
That there's a place for general purpose AI, which is essentially chat based LLMs for for quick analysis and summary and sort of sifting through the data, right, to package things up in a way that then a purpose built AI tool, meaning that it's engineered and also architected on a with with data and typically proprietary methodology and sort of decisioning flows, et cetera, for a specific domain or industry. But purpose built AI can then work with those inputs, right? To work with that data store or the data pipeline, however you want to think about it, and which might honestly, in some cases, just be represented as a document, right? Let alone a data store. But the point being that I think that it's an and. Now, with that said, if you were going to propose to me, like, hey, Gwen, I think we should just use general purpose AI. And what's the shortfall there? I will say that there's a couple of aspects that people need to be aware of. And some of these things you might actually have already observed or maybe had a hunch about in using general purpose AI just in your personal life, right? Whether it's looking at let's compare options for purchasing a car, or let's compare options for how should I approach the whole house replumbing for the remodel that I'm doing, whatever it is, right? That you're going to notice inconsistencies and also some drift when you ask the same question or the same type of question. You're going to get a slightly different answer, right? You're also going to notice that if it's a topic that is specific to a particular industry or it requires terminology or an understanding, that's domain specific, whether it's because it's a slightly legal oriented question or because it has to do with whole house replumbing, right? That you can't quite rely on the precision. So, domain relevance and precision is the second point. So, the first one was consistency, and the domain relevance is the second. And then third, it's not going to, even though a lot of general purpose AI claims to give observability or traceability in terms of citing things, it's still really difficult to clearly see, okay, here's where this assumption is coming from.
Right.
And even when it's citing things, it might have the wrong citation. So I think that it's safe to say that none of us are going and double checking all of the little footnoted citations that a general purpose AI tool is bringing back to us. And I will say that even though I don't have the stats in front of me, there's this set of research that I came across, I think it was a couple of months ago now, earlier this year, where it stack ranked the sources for air quotes, research data that general purpose AI tools use to go then look for answers and understand something, whatever the question is from the user. And the top one's Reddit.
Right.
LinkedIn, I think, was number 3. I'm not saying that there isn't good information, good thinking happening, right, on these platforms, but I'm saying that would you really trust a domain specific, let alone high stakes like M&A decision and set of plans around, on information that comes from LinkedIn and Reddit, et cetera.
Right.
So again, general purpose AI tools are trained on publicly available data for the most part, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's basically, that's basically the size of it. Now, if you then shift over to looking at purpose-built AI, and I'll just be, vendor agnostic here for the moment, for a tool to be that and a legitimate purpose-built AI, it needs to be a platform that embeds some sort of catalog of guardrails and patterns, right? Back to the notion of patterns that we were talking about at the top of the call, that helps you essentially feed the general purpose AI model through and puts it in guardrails for how to understand things. It grounds it in the domain specific relevance and gives it precision, because you also have checks and quality and making sure that it's checking not only an understanding of your question or prompt to it, but also checking and rechecking the output to make sure it's grounded and tethered to the methodology or the domain knowledge, et cetera, before it goes out the door. So that's what's usually referred to as agents on rails, right? Because you're not just giving a general purpose AI tool like free roam and saying, hey, I need an integration plan. And then it goes out and then it gets something and then it comes back and gives you something, right? But it's each step of the way, putting it through its paces in the construct of a methodology. And then in the case of our platform, a decision architecture. And so that's one thing that I'll call out that I think actually touches on a whole lot of the topics we've already, skated through, which is it's important for both human workloads, but also, for goodness sake, if you're using an AI tool, to consider that you need to have meaning before intelligence, and not to be, not to try to create a new, catchphrase. But the point is that you need to know what the basic components and patterns really mean, and maybe even specifically to you as an acquirer, and what those patterns are, before then you can go devise a strategy.
Right.
So the meaning to the M&A domain, and also, of course, to you specifically, yourself as an acquirer in your industry, and the deal specific context around, it's that target, right? A general purpose AI tool is not going to have any of that. It's not going to be factoring any of that in. So that's really, I think, a nutshell view of how to think about general purpose versus purpose-built.
So let me push on this a little bit because I'm learning more in this space. I'm a moderately well-informed user of some of the big chat platforms, but unless I beat it up and put a bunch of stuff into project memory, it doesn't remember the project I'm working on. And when I was using enterprise level, like I had to really wrestle with the AI for it to understand what I could put into it around the deal. So if we think about this, right, we've got leaner teams that are running based on the headcount cuts that we've seen since the pandemic.
Yeah.
We've got these general tools that don't remember this context. And so how does it change when all of a sudden your AI is built for integration, built for decisions, and it remembers your deal? So how is
Yeah.
that how what kind of difference does that really make?
I have to say and this will just show a bit of, I think like you, what a perpetual M&A nerd I am. Because when I think about the potential and I think about the super long hours and heroics that myself and colleagues would apply to get a deal, not just over the line as far as close, but then the really hard, complex work to get integration planning and wrangle stakeholders and subject matter experts and business unit leaders to actually execute. And yet that took super long hours and it was super reactive, right? So what's possible now is, yes, automation, and yes, that saves you time, but it more importantly, it gives you the ability to focus on the high impact decision making and to really surface and clarify these are the decisions that are not only open, but here's how they interconnect, right? So for instance, within our platform, it's really focused on build, validate, and deploy strategy, right? Across the deal phases. And part of that is the aspect of decisioning as a through line. And yes, part of it is roles, responsibilities, who's approving decisions, et cetera. But again, just
Sure.
to hammer home the why, as far as why are you doing the deal? What are the value drivers? The ability to get a tool's help to focus in on, okay, this decision point that's open right now and giving us all a headache around when do we transition the acquired legal entity, which for those of you who haven't lived through that decision, it can be a doozy, right? Because
Yeah.
it seems mundane, right? And if you go ask, someone from the legal work stream that is tasked with coordinating, that bit, if you ask them, well, when should we do that? Or when that's missing from your plan as far as the timeline, like when should we do that? And they'll come back and say, it depends, right?
Right.
And so my point here, again, not to be annoying, but it depends, right? Web of interdependencies and potential impacts and ripple effect that having a platform that has the meaning and the intelligence, not just automation, it then makes you make faster work of navigating it depends and also understanding which of those decisions and especially if it's been open and been a gap for some time, which of those decisions are most impactful to the deal thesis, right? Whatever it is you're assuming. Like if you're not assuming cross-selling revenue uplift for that acquihire, then that's going to be simpler. And there's going to be certain it depends that you don't have to worry about. But if you are, not to mention other types of synergies, cost synergies, et cetera, then you need to be able to navigate decisions as fast as possible and precisely as possible and keep track of the assumptions because as we all know, it's pretty rare that you go chug down the tracks with integration planning and execution and not come up against any curveballs that then
Right.
prompt "Oh, we have to adjust course." Or, you know what? That deal steerco member just decided we're going to completely pivot as far as the assumption for what to do with those acquired products, or maybe one of them we retire and one of them we're going to keep in market. And oh, by the way, we want to sell it globally with our joint sales forces in 1 month post close or something crazy, right?
Right.
So to be able to assess very quickly, like A, that's not going to fly ever. That's impossible, so you can push back to steerco. Or B, well, it is possible, but here's what it's going to take,
Right.
right? That's the
Yeah.
key. So I think that's really the seriously exciting, powerful punch of you get force multiplication, but the ability to navigate decisions with more clarity and velocity, that's awesome.
Right.
So,
It's funny you mentioned that. I remember a deal I did many, many years ago where a member of the steer co at the beginning, no revenue synergies were part of it. And then all of the sudden it was to make the deal math work and to get board approval, there had to be revenue synergies baked in. And
mhm,
so we were reviewing this and there was no cross training plan for the sales force on either side. So nobody had considered those costs or that time frame. And here I am, the HR guy, going, "Hey, when are we gonna actually train people to cross sell?" And
right.
I was very politely told to go sit down and do my job, because there wasn't time to consider that. And then it, of course, popped up when we were integrating, and we dealt with it
Right.
then. But I think having a tool that would have said, okay, you're now adding this. Now you've got to think about these 5 things would have been really, really helpful at that point.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that really just it underscores just again that you need to think about the fact that humans are involved and that
Right.
is not an academic, or just a set of, mathematics, right? As far as like making the numbers work. Well, it's like, who are you assuming is going to do that? It sounds like a flip question, but really it's just it's very pragmatic. Like whatever it is that you're assuming in the deal thesis, at some point before close, you need to ask yourself at the deal circo level, well, who's going to do that? Who's
Right.
going to sell it? Who's going to provide those services? Who's going to do that, that customer migration, whatever it is. And then once you understand that, then that can let you, raise the very important question that comes, fast follow, which is, well, are they going to be positioned to do that? Do they have enough people? Are they going to be enabled? Et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, not to mention, will they want to? And that's a whole nother question, right? Back to
Right.
the like cultural element that I was talking about with the hot mess deal. You have to consider whether like behavioral, like incentives, monetary and otherwise, like, are people going to want to do whatever it is you need them to support or execute? So,
Yeah. Well, Gwen, as we get close to the end of our time together, I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal ball for a moment. And I would love to hear your thoughts on where the M&A operating model is headed for. Let's not stress the crystal ball too much. Let's just go 5 years out. Where do you think this is all going?
uh, I think that one of the things, and you're seeing this pattern in, whether it's economics or a number of other aspects, but where there's a widening gap between sort of states of being, whether, again, whether it's monetary or otherwise, there's this divergence. And I really think that prior to, maybe a couple of years ago, there was this, for better for worse, ability for large serial acquirers to play a little bit fast and loose with
Mhm.
whether or not there was actually value creation or or something that was done with the deal that made it worth it. And I'm being that general on purpose because do I think that you need to the letter, like hit that 9% cost synergy, or do you need to, right? Maybe not. And maybe you find that there's course refinements post close to the plan, et cetera. But my point is that generally speaking, there was a good deal of, you know, sort of fast and loose decisions around, oh, well, you know what? It's done enough, right? And it didn't create any value or create synergies. You know what? On to the next one. And particularly in serial acquirers where maybe they were doing well otherwise, right? Apart from M&A. So you could just sort of absorb these silent failures. But now that's changed. And certainly there's plenty of companies that are doing well financially in a general sense, but the competitive stakes are much higher. And some of the data points and research that you and I have collaborated on, point to a lot of the factors that I'm just sort of glancing over. But the point is that the wiggle room for the margin for error is much smaller as far as the impact of failing to execute a deal well, or maybe even failing to come up with a valid deal thesis in the first place. The stakes around competitively as far as being a first mover into a space, or maybe you need to execute well for a defensive position or whatever it is, it's so much higher. So you take all of that and then you add to it the fact that, as you mentioned, dedicated M&A teams are smaller and smaller and smaller. Then what you're going to see is a divide between acquirers that, at least in some modicum of fashion, have taken the time and applied the priority to define an operating model for how
Right.
they approach M&A. So not only is it not ad hoc and totally reactive, but that they have some intentionality around it that's informed in part by, again, know yourself as an acquirer, your capabilities and your gaps. So there's that. But then looking at acquirers that don't do that, I think that the impact and, the essentially the knock-on effect of failing on individual deals is going to be much bigger. And the literally outperforming, your competition in the market, whatever your space is, the divide is going to be really stark. And I think there's for those that are interested, there's data points and more granular, research grounded material around a lot of these topics and stuff that Klint and I have put out before. But the general idea is that the it's going to be much more powerful and much more impactful to have a repeatable operating model. And of course, that's not just systems. It's the people, the
Right.
process, the technology, right? That is relevant to how you do M&A. So
Yeah.
I think that's my biggest call out.
Yeah. I think it's a good one. I was talking to a friend of mine that works in private equity a couple of days ago, Gwen, and they're starting to see that now with the longer hold times that they're experiencing in PE. And I can't remember. I think it was the New York Times Deal Book was saying that the number of companies that are being held and available for sale in the next 5 years is triple what it was. And that there's something like a 7-year backlog of companies for them to either take public or divest out of their portfolios during the hold period. And,
Yeah,
and it's because they can't create the value that they used to be able to create through financial engineering. So they've got to do something different.
that's right. And absolutely. And one of the aspects there too is that some of those portfolio companies are then having to turn to being acquisitive, right,
Right.
themselves to accelerate their growth. So
Yeah.
it's interesting layer of situations.
Yeah. Well, look, as M&A geeks, I think that bodes for exciting times for us up ahead. And I think your crystal ball is very, very clear in this case. So, Gwen, thank you again. For folks that want to connect with you or look at Tiger Team's work, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah. So obviously our website, tigerteammna.com, or you can just use the quick and dirty route, which is to find me, Gwen Pope, on LinkedIn, and then you can find all roads from there as far as company website, et cetera, and to reach out directly to, for an intro call, or you want to see an informal demo of our platform, understand and maybe a little bit better some of the topics that we've talked about today, then certainly reach out. Happy to take the time.
Perfect. We'll drop those in the show notes. And then just one more plug with what we said at the beginning over the course of 2026 and probably into 27. If you're not listening to this in the far, far future, we're going to be having some hackathons using the tech. So I'm super excited about that. So
Yes,
yeah.
that's
Gwen,
going to be
thank you.
awesome.
Oh yeah, these are going to be really incredible. This is what happens when you get a couple of M&A geeks together. So Gwen, thank you again. I'm really excited we finally had the chance to sit down and do this and looking forward to more to come.
Absolutely. Thanks, Clint.